So, huge welcome to Jon Alexander. And Jon, I think we've been bumping into each other for several years. And I'm really excited that you've written this book, this new book. Here we go, Citizens, Why the Key to Fixing Everything is All of Us. And I've just been, watching you appear here, there, and everywhere, actually, having a great time promoting your book. But I'm going to start by inviting you to introduce yourself and the main sort of proposition of Citizens. And we'll go from there. And, take your time. Don't be in a hurry.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to do this. It's interesting when you said you were going to invite me to introduce myself. I was thinking, how do I do that these days? I think what I would say is I think I'm a storyteller. And I think I began my career in the advertising industry and I think of that as a storytelling industry. But not actually an industry that tells a particular story. And I think what I'm trying to do and trying to be is someone who's part of the telling of and the building of a very different story to that. So to say a bit more about myself in that context. So like I say, I began my career in the advertising industry, and there was a seminal moment for me really when my first boss described my job to me by saying, what you've got to remember is that the average consumer sees something like 3,000 commercial messages a day, and your job is to cut through that and make yours the best. And for a while I was happy in the second half of that sentence and found the intellectual challenge very stimulating, but then came back as most normal people will have done, most people might have done rather quicker, and said, well, what are we doing to ourselves? Like, what, 3,000? And the most recent studies suggest it could be anything up to 10,000. Like, what are we doing to ourselves when we have that level of priming and prompting and almost insistence? And the way I came to see it was that we're telling ourselves a story. And that story is what I've come to call the consumer story. It's a story that says the right thing to do actually is to look out for number one, to choose the best deal for yourself from those that are offered, and pursue your own self-interest on the basis that will add up to, that if everyone does that, individual self-interest will aggregate to collective interest. And I mean, it's explicit in things like Milton Friedman saying the social responsibility of business is to maximize its profits. Like, that is a direct assertion of that same logic. And I guess the more I saw that, the less I was able to keep working in the advertising industry, even selling better stuff, or selling train over plane, or greener products or whatever, because ultimately the what I was trapped in was the work of telling a story I didn't believe in. I was trapped as a sort of priest of a religion I didn't follow. And when I was able to move out of the advertising industry and get some distance from that, I began to see two things really, two alternative stories, two other stories. Because I think too often we can see ourselves in the consumer story and think that it's inevitable and immutable and the way things have always been. And the first thing I realized was that it's not the way things have always been. It's only been around really for 80 years or so. And I began to delve into what I've come to call the subject story, which I think was dominant in society for a long time, up until the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, and has its sort of locus in Britain actually, which I think is part of why our shared home is finding it so difficult at the moment, because we have this center of gravity, and actually a story that says it's not even it's not even right to pursue self-interest, that the right thing to do is to keep your head down, do as you're told, get what you're given, like the sort of Victorian morality of do your duty. And that story worked on the basis that that's the right thing to do, because the God-given few know best, and they'll lead us to the best outcomes for society. And then the third story that I've increasingly come to see, not just as a story that's available now, but as a story that's bubbled and come through in different ways and places throughout human history, is the citizen story. And the citizen story says the right thing to do actually is to get involved, to share your ideas, energy, and resources to the search for the best outcomes for society as a whole, on the basis that all of us are smarter than any of us, that it's actually through the act of tapping into and actively inviting the contributions of everyone, that is the way that we will discover the best outcomes for society as a whole. And I see that bubbling in this. And so really the story I'm telling is a story about the moment in time we're living in. And it's a story that says most people see it as some kind of collapse. And we see the rising danger of a return to something like the subject story. Most of us see to some degree the collapse of the consumer story. We see that ever increasing consumption is unsustainable, that the inequality can't cope with us continuing to see society as a ladder that we climb, etc., etc. And we also see the danger of the alternative to that being a return to the authoritarian, the strongman leader, and so on. But because we see those as the only two options, we tend to prefer reinitiating, reinstigating, rebooting the consumer story. And what I'm trying to do, I think, is say, actually, this citizen story is here. It's all around us, and I'm trying to. The reason I say I'm a storyteller is because I think what I'm trying to do is the only real innovation in my work is to offer these names and labels. It's to say, like, we see many of us in our many disciplines and sectors see, if you're in government world, open policy making and citizens assemblies and participatory budgeting and If you're in business, you see equity crowdfunding and open idea generation and citizen science. And if you're in charity world, you see movements and. But I think what I'm trying to, if I'm offering something, the story I'm offering is something that says, no, that's all part of one thing. Like this, if we see these as a whole, they become more than the sum of the parts, and they become a story that we can inhabit and that can actually become the structuring story of our time. And I think when you see that, you also say, coming out of the two world wars, we had an extraordinary period of institutional innovation. The European Union, the OECD, the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the National Health Service in the UK, all of these things were created in that time. And I would argue were created from the consumer story, were created from the consumer story. The National Health Service, the idea of trade as the route to peace that sits at the heart of so many of these multinational institutions, that they are all expressions of a consumer hypothesis about how we build the best society. And so my challenge that I would offer is that I think we need a period of institutional innovation on that scale and with that ambition, but from within and manifesting and buttressing the citizen story rather than the consumer story.
Okay, that's a huge proposition. So let me, yeah, and obviously I welcome it. But let me then push you a bit further with that. So where do because I see that you're saying, you seem to me to be saying two things at once. One is, it's a story of the citizen, and the story of many citizens creating a we story. Then you seem to be calling for something. We need these new, we need institutional innovation. But where's that going to come from? If it's not coming from the state or from government, or when you're calling for it, who are you calling to?
So the story, if I may answer that with a story.
Yeah.
The in the research for the book just made me come alive, really, was what's happened in Taiwan over the last decade. Basically what if you go back to 2012, Taiwan was pretty analogous to where I would argue the UK is now. They had a government that were essentially saying to people, shush little people, just go shopping, we'll deal with the tricky stuff, and probably trying to weasel power in doing so. They called it the economic power up plan. They were literally saying to people, we'll deal with the difficult stuff. And a group of hackers started to organize. They called themselves gov-zero, which was named after what they did was they built parallel websites to government websites, and each of these websites had the URL g0v.tw instead of .gov.tw, and they talked about forking the government, which is all quite fun, right? And people started to use these things, and what they allowed was commenting and upvoting, and they scraped a load of data, and they just basically sort of started to show, imagine if, it was almost an arts project, right? It was like, imagine if government worked like this. And people started to use it, particularly students. And then 2014 came, and there was an attempt to rush through a trade bill with mainland China, and it triggered a student protest, much along the lines of the Occupy movement. They occupied the parliament, about 1,000 students. And what gov-zero did was they got a broadband connection in and started streaming what the students were doing in the parliament, which was debating the clauses of the trade bill. And what happened then was the kind of critical moment, because the energy started to build. People could see what was going on. There was sympathy building. Lots of candidates around the country were saying, we're with the students. And pressure came on the Speaker of the Parliament to boot them out. And the Speaker was a member of the governing party. And he could have said, the most likely thing for him to do was to boot them out. And he said, no. He said, this is what democracy looks like. This is what this space is for. And in that moment, he reframed the whole relationship between citizen and state in that country. And from then on, the transformation was incredibly rapid. Within a matter of months, there were municipal elections, and candidates who'd stood alongside the protesters were elected in all over the country. Within 2 years, there was a presidential election. One of the leaders of the hacker movement, who had already by that point become a mentor to a government minister, became a minister in her own right. And then when COVID came in 2020, 4 years later, this was the group of people who were running the country's response. And doing things like open challenge prizes and open source contests and hackathons and a phone line where anyone could ring in with ideas for how the country's response could be better and. But the zooming back in on that moment, because I think that's where the answer to your question lies. I don't think that the story will be constructed solely by people organizing outside of the existing institutions. I think I think it's going to depend on Speaker Wang's, for want of a better word, and that's who I'm really talking to. It's the people in positions of power in the existing system, and I don't just mean the Speaker of Parliament, obviously, and I don't even just mean MPs, or Lords or whatever. I mean CEOs. I mean directors of NGOs. I mean all of these people who are at the heads of existing institutions or near the heads of them, because what they can open up to is the reinvention of the institutions of which they're part. so one of the examples I give in the book, one of the thought experiments I undertake in the book, is what if the leadership of Amnesty International and Oxfam International and others were to hold a process to crowdsource a renewal of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for this moment in time, on the basis that the original UDHR was is a profound and important piece of work. I'm not denigrating it, and yet it was designed and developed by a very small selection of people, centered in America, for the world, and it has as its root conception of the sort of smallest unit of society, the individual. And yet many of the, if not all of the greatest abuses of the last 80 years have been abuses of cultures and collectives and peoples rather than of individuals. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has done relatively little actually to stop those things from happening. So yeah, but the spirit of this is yes, and it's saying it was way better, and this is why I think talking about subject consumer citizen rather than just consumer citizen is so important. The UDHR is so much better and so vital in moving us on from the world that existed pre-World War II, and it's out of date.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm appreciating very much what you're suggesting, and it sounds kind of doable, from in the way that you're describing, and it's almost like a lovely fantasy now. Let's hold that possibility in our minds. But let me just question you a little bit more deeply around, for example, Taiwan. So I'm quite familiar with what happened in Taiwan, and I know actually that there's quite a lot of popularity around the software, the Polis software that was used. And in fact, I even think Audrey Tang has been touring America and other places, promoting this like form of citizens engagement. But something suggests to me that it's not as easy as it looks outside of Taiwan. Now, there's a couple of things about Taiwan that made it very amenable. One is that it's an island. It's got an identity, particularly in relationship to China. So it's not China. So it's a little bit like maybe we imagine Scotland might be not England, right? It's that kind of scenario. And it's very helpful to have that. But underneath it as well, and I was noticing this with the COVID, how COVID unfurled in Taiwan compared to here. There's something else in the society there that makes it I don't know, somehow able to take on ideas of we action, working as we. And it could be something, I'm exploring this myself, I'm myself, from Asia. And so I recognize a sort of a more willingness to be social and to act in the society's interest than the place where we are now. I'm not saying that we couldn't be that as well over here, but maybe we're in a different part of our history at this point. I'm not sure how to describe that. But do you feel that this readiness to be social is there across society? I mean, I'm sure it's there in pockets, there's no question, because we can see these pockets everywhere, right? But how do you feel it would land? Why are we in this kind of Brexit scenario, with this, obviously a lot to do with the culture of our politics, but could we just move, do you think, from being really binary to something much more together?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. What's the best way to answer this? So I think just to dwell in this idea of these stories, because I think that there are differences, and yet there are also much deeper similarities in my view. Like we are I would argue, so there's a way of seeing this where you just go, the Asian cultures have a more collective vibe, and you just accept, and you sort of go, oh well, we're never gonna. I would argue by slightly differently that humans are by nature citizens, all of us. We are collaborative, caring, creative creatures. We want to get stuck in, we want to do stuff. There are differences in the extent to which nations and towns and regions are trapped in the consumer story, or have a presence of the subject story. So in Russia, for example, I think the subject story is arguably incredibly present, and has been deliberately constructed. The idea of Putin as the sort of father of the nation, and we're seeing that play out on the global stage. In India at the moment, arguably Modi is trying to lean into that. Xi in China is trying to lean into that. But we here have this sort of weird fusion of the consumer story that we in the America and the States have been absolutely at the forefront of, with actually having been the final climactic home of the subject story at the end of the 19th century. And that is a heady mix and a very powerful one. And I think you're right in the sense that we're slightly less, but I still think, and the reason I started with this thing, I still think that we are citizens by nature, and that can be unlocked incredibly quickly. So the day I decided to write the book actually was in May 2020, when the message changed, our government's message changed. So up until that point, and from when they first, I mean, the starting point was the consumer story, right? Like the first instinct of our government was to let COVID wash through the nation because people won't accept the limitations because we're a freedom-loving whatever. But when that was obviously going horrendously, then we moved to the subject story. COVID was an invisible mugger. The message was stay home, protect, and the bargain was obedience, like protection in return for obedience. That is and always has been the subject story, going right back to King Sargon of Akkad, right? But when that started to fall apart, which it did, because the same week that they changed the message was the week that UK exceeded Italy for its death rate. The message had to change again. But if you remember what was happening in the UK at that time, we were being citizens. Like, mutual aid groups were springing up everywhere, street WhatsApp groups, even in the sort of the gated communities were kind of opening up. And you remember the NHS first responder thing, where they built a website to accept 250,000 volunteers in 3 weeks, and they got 750,000 in 48 hours, which by the way we're just experiencing again with a website to offer your home to Ukrainian refugees that was built for 10,000 people and got crashed by 130,000. But we were doing it, and that could have been a Speaker Wang moment, as I will henceforth describe them. Yes. If we could have seen that, and if we could have gone, okay, right, let's instigate a citizens reference panel to several people were calling for this, including the RSA. I think you guys were involved in this, the Alternative, others. Let's make SAGE, the scientific advisory group, behave like independent SAGE and have open meetings and or let's open a phone line like the Taiwanese did. Or, like, the Taiwanese published 125 things that they'd done in an English language journal on March the 3rd, right? This stuff was out there. And if we had done that, I think that was a Speaker Wang moment. I think the story was there and building, and councils were reorganizing, and it was all happening. And I'm not saying it would have been simple and overnight and whatever, but I am saying if that message could have become, let's do this. I mean, I'm making stuff up off the top of my head.
No. My question to you, but my question to you, and again, I love it. I love the notion, but I'm personally still feeling myself a little bit like, as if you're describing something that needs permission to happen. Like, as if because, we were invited to do this, then we did it en masse, and the Speaker Wang moment suggests to me that there has to be a Speaker Wang, right? And in our setup in the UK and in the States, I would say, anywhere where there's a first past the post setup, that's hard to find that person, right? Because if for example, I'm going to go into a bit more detail now. So, I think that, for example, Michael Gove is always suggesting that there's going to be more citizens' involvement. And he's always suggesting that the communities will be empowered. So did David Cameron, right? But there's always a suggestion that it'll be empowered to the extent that they will allow it.
Yeah.
Right. So, and the worry is for us is that, and the worry for a lot of communities is that, is that they will be empowered basically to take over the services that government should be responsible for. So it's all of this volunteer work that could be happening and that is happening, might end up replacing the national health or, other things that the government is already collecting our taxes for. So that's a slight worry that empowerment in that sense will be taking on a burden as opposed to liberating us. And how would you see, where does the really liberating force come from? Because my question in what you're saying is, what about the naysayers, the people who've been refusing to comply with vaccines, for example? This is something that's happened all over Europe. It's everywhere. There are people who are perceiving the way that the government has tried to manage the COVID crisis as overall in the name of the social good, but still oppressive to many. We've got to the point now, for example, in Austria or, possibly in Germany, in fact, that they all reached nearly that point, but had to pull back from it, where vaccines became mandatory. So now we're suddenly in this story of, for the common good, you no longer have a right over your own body. Now there's a danger there, right? Of who's naming the common good now?
Yeah, I mean, so look, on vaccines specifically, if you withhold agency from people, they become suspicious, rightly so. And so what we should have been doing, I believe, is making these decisions about even about mandatory status, if we have to have let it get to that point, through participatory processes involving people in those things, because it's when you don't involve people that you get to that situation in the first place. Because what you do is you cultivate distrust and so, I mean, look, we could, even more extreme than vaccine rejection is QAnon, right? Like that whole thing, the deep reason for the success is because it gives people agency.
Yeah.
And so when you say to people, just trust us. We haven't. I mean, especially when it comes from institutions and organisations that have not behaved particularly trustworthy. Then I completely understand where people are coming from. I don't subscribe to it myself. I don't endorse it at all, but I completely understand. And it's the same with the vote to leave the European Union. In my mind, was like you withhold agency systemically from people for a whole period of time, then of course the line "take back control" is going to appeal to them, and it can be co-opted. But the response to that has to be to push power out, not to start distrusting people. And I don't think that's what you're saying. But what I do hear in what you're saying is maybe there's sort of two challenges that you're throwing at me. I sense that one of them is like, do we really need the institutions to open up, like, or do we just crack on and do it ourselves? And I think my answer to that is a bit of a both and. Because I am what COVID in particular, and I think it's happening again now, has taught what I've taken from that is that the power of the existing institutions over the dominant story is intense.
Mm.
And what they can't do is stop us from being citizens and organising and coming again and again and again, and we must do that.
Mm.
But what they can do is break the story and make it very hard for us to keep doing that, and very hard for us to believe it's possible. So where I was going to finish up my thing about that day the message changed was, of course, it didn't change to let's do this. It changed from stay home to stay alert. And what that message was a consumer story message. And it said, like, individual responsibility. That's how this country works. Look out for yourself and you'll be okay. If they don't look out for themselves, they'll get sick. It'll be their fault. And it was very swiftly followed by the scheme called Eat Out to Help Out. Like, are you kidding me? Like, there was a Times front page that said Johnson encourages us to go shopping. And we were back in 2001 in the World Trade Center. Like, it's insane.
Yeah.
But that power, I think we have to acknowledge that power, and we have to find ways to break it.
Yeah. And
break into it.
Okay, so I've got lots of questions coming in my head. So one of them would be, because there was no question that going to eat out at that point caused another wave, plus people did just respond, right? They'd been cooped up and then they went out. So these are kind of like local moments, where you could trigger people into behavior. There's no question about that. That's powerful use of the messaging and the storytelling. But the longer term one, the slower burn is that, if I'm reading it rightly, over COVID, people have become a bit more disillusioned with the power of shopping. And they have become, disillusioned with government to some extent, that and that in itself is a bit of a pregnant moment, meaning I noticed, and in fact, I noticed at the beginning of COVID that quite often government was holding on to a story, but other institutions preempted them. For example, we were moving from the, I can't remember the term now, but, let rip, to slowly to like stay home. But the Football Association went well ahead and stopped the matches. Before the government said stop the matches, they stopped the matches because they were already thinking in these terms. And I wonder if there aren't, original, more unusual sort of forms of authority that can call things that we don't really think about very much. I'm very fond of thinking about what is the role of football. I mean, it absolutely is a consumer.
Well, yeah, I mean, the England football team broke the back of the culture war in the UK, at least for now, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. There's that, right? So is there sometimes?
But let's zoom in on that. Let's zoom in on that, because I think what happened in that moment was they basically usurped the storytelling power of government.
Yeah.
And they made it impossible for government for our ministers to tell the story that they wanted to tell, and they had to step in. And that, I think, is the thing we can learn from, because the government then did tell a story, but they had to tell Gareth Southgate's story.
Yes.
And that's what we had. But it wasn't about government being less important. It was about making it impossible for them to do anything else. Now, let me give you a thought experiment to illustrate what I mean with this. So remember when XR first kicked off, the first Extinction Rebellion?
Sure.
And everyone, like, everyone loved it, right? Like, almost universally, it was like, thank God someone is saying it. And like I've said this before, my mum wanted to go and be like, my mum is not that lady, for all that she's amazing and wonderful and brilliant. She was going on to Waterloo Bridge, and we forget how popular they were. And it's because they were that popular, I would argue, that the Citizens' Assembly, that the Climate Assembly was commissioned by 6 select committees, not by the executive, not with the power that XR wanted it to have, not on the timeline that XR demanded, but it was their central demand, and they got it. But they then ignored it because I would argue because it wasn't good enough. And look, I'm saying this, I want to be really clear, I'm saying this like 2020 is hindsight. Like, I love the people. I got such admiration, particularly for some of the political thinkers in exile. But like, just with that held, what if they had said yes and to the climate assembly instead of no? And so might they have timed their next rebellions for the weekend meetings of the assembly and pointed at it and got Attenborough to come and speak to thousands of people gathered outside the meeting room of the climate assembly after he'd addressed the 100-odd people? What if they'd made that process so famous, more famous than the World Cup final or whatever it was we got to? Sorry, I'm not very good on football. But like that would have been as impossible to ignore as Tyrone Mings and the
Okay. So now I'm going to invite you to think with me about these multiple forms of agency, right? Because you could actually be then now describing, if you think about Extinction Rebellion, in our hearts, we hold the same goals, right? And you probably would find that if you polled all the MPs in Westminster, they would also say the same. Of course, we want to save the planet, right? But the competing narratives, how do you align them is my question. Because it seems to me with Extinction Rebellion, at least at the beginning, hell-bent, on bringing a government down and to expose, the whole lie of the growth economy, extraction, and so on, and the state we're in. Big story to try to deliver. So how does that work alongside, you've just raised it yourself, competing stories of this is developmental, this is evolutionary, we have to build on our gains, step by step. It's almost like a very different kind of animus. It's a different energy, the activist energy and the civil society energy, two quite different storylines, but also different forms of agency, I would say. So can we hold these together and still help them move towards the same goal? Because if we end up with competing stories, and I know you talk about this in your book, so I'm inviting you to talk about it now. When there are competing stories, how do you bring them into some sort of coherence so that we don't just fall foul to the same problem of being subject to this idea that, we're always going to be competing with each other rather than really coming together?
I mean, I guess, look, I actually think there is a profound problem with the obsession with breaking something. And I just don't think that can work, I'm afraid. Like, I think rejection, I think we're beyond the space of rejection. I think we have to be in the space of creation and transcending and that kind of thing. It's like, and when you, like, I keep coming back at the moment to the Buckminster Fuller thing about, like, to change the existing, you don't fight the existing reality, you create a new. And I'm like, and I keep thinking, like, every time anyone talks about anti-capitalist or post-capitalist, they're still talking about capitalist. And I'm just like, I just don't have time for that. Like, if we activism that requires people to just reject is activism, if it might even be sort of subject activism, because it's just saying, like, do as you're told, right? Like, it's tribal. And I guess I'm going, like, how do we I think we have to be in, I think this work is about saying we have to be we have to be building the next way decisions are made, and demonstrating and modeling, and not and trusting people. And I think maybe that's where it really comes back to, is that I think so much of this work, or so much of the sort of activist energy, conventional activist energy, maybe, you'll have to help me, challenge me on this, I don't know, but my where I'm at the moment is that I think way too much of that starts by accepting, actually, consciously or unconsciously, the basic premise of the consumer story, which is that people are shit. That at some level people are selfish, and therefore the task is to save people from themselves. And I just don't think that can ever work. I think we have to, if we don't come from a place where we're trying to unleash and release and open up the innate kind of capacity for building and creating, and if we don't see that in everyone, and I mean the CEOs and the, like, I want to really, at the edge of my like learning and thinking at the moment, I was in Edinburgh for TEDx Countdown, and I was in the room when Ben, what's his face, the Shell CEO, was torn down by the Stop Cambo protester Lorna, and who then left the stage. And I'm still not sure what I think about that moment. Because it felt like such a performance for the audience, and like the acceptance of the creation of two tribes. And yet I have deep sympathy with the driving instincts of that. So look, I don't want to appear like more certain than I am, or pretend to you that I'm more certain than I am, but for me, I believe that that is what I believe we need to construct. My theory of change is to construct Speaker Wang moments, basically, at the local, national, international level. And I believe that that's work that is fundamentally about proposal rather than rejection. And I believe that it's fundamentally rooted in believing that what we are trying to do is make it possible for people to be who we naturally want to be, rather than prevent or harness our worst nature cunningly for the greater good.
So this leaves me with maybe a final question then, which would be, how do you see your own role going forward? Because if I'm, and I might be barking up the wrong tree now, but if I'm thinking about Speaker Wang, I'm thinking about the person who is in a position of power, giving that power away, right? Or opening the doors for others to walk in, right? And say, this is your space. And so a space creator. But that person has to be in the place with the power. So that would suggest to me that you still harbor some ambition to be a politician and in a position of being able to give that power away. Or am I completely wrong there?
I would in a way sort of flip the logic of and the order even of what you just said. Like I honestly don't know where I'm going next. I think what I'm seeking is an understanding that helps me figure out what role to play and where that role might be. among other things, I'm not. This isn't an entirely kind of personal journey, but there's always an element of the personal, right, that we need to acknowledge.
Yeah.
I think there is something. I think and hope there is something I can offer, and maybe I am a useful voice for this kind of thing, because I am the embodiment of the system, right? Like because I'm 40, straight, white, 6 foot tall, male. Like I am the system, poshly educated, went to Cambridge, I've got the same classics degree as Boris Johnson, right? Like. Well, my name is almost the same as his, like Jonathan Alexander versus Alexander Johnson. You could just like.
I wouldn't labour that too much.
No, I'm not planning to tell that to many people, but yeah. But like you can kind of I think, but and if that means it is, but I'm not getting to there from a place of going, I want to be in politics, so therefore I will construct a narrative that enables me. I'm really, really reticent to think that is the right route for me. I'm like, I don't enjoy that space. I've gone near it and gone, this stinks. Yeah. And I certainly wouldn't go into it on its current terms. Yeah. But like I am who I am. I look how I look. I have the privilege I have, and if there is something I can do with that, then I will absolutely do it. And so I don't know. Yeah, I hope that's some kind of answer. It's like, right, like I
No. It is absolutely an answer, because I do sense that there are so many people who are not sure, as things are emerging, where to really put themselves.
Yeah.
But I think you've made quite a good offer there, in a sort of in a way, the demand should be there for a different kind of politician, and.
I mean, that's why the last section of the book is like how to be an anti-hero, and it is basically about like who is Speaker Wang and what's he doing, and that is where my thinking has got up to, is that as you say, like basically my working hypothesis now is that there is a critical role for leaders. The citizen story is not a leaderless story.
Yeah.
But it's a story that reinterprets the role of leaders as being door openers, space holders, microphone passers, rather than either commanders or servants. Yeah. And I think that, and the immediate work I'm trying to do in the tour with the book, and in the few bits of work that I'm continuing to do alongside it, is things like so working to try and build a coalition of organizations around the idea of a people's plan for nature, on the basis that there's a big nature documentary series going live in the UK at the beginning of next year, and if someone doesn't create an outsider participatory democracy process, then the bloody thing will air and everyone will be told to stop using plastic straws again. And I'm like, well, let's prep. Let's be ready, because if that creates a Speaker Wang moment, stuff, right? Yeah. Like that's the kind of work I feel drawn to right now.
Yeah, and once a storyteller, always a storyteller. I can certainly feel sometimes when I'm reading your book, I can feel that you are that advertising man. Well. Because you're giving us a good story, right? And I think that's necessary now. We're always, as you say, we're always going to be subject to stories. We don't get rid of stories; we just tell better ones. And yeah, I'm gonna look forward to that emerging and getting strong. Jon, thanks very much for your time. I'm going to stop there. I'm sure there's going to be many more of these conversations in this really steep hill over the next few years. But for now. Thanks again.